At a bustling airport, a young black teenager, Kyler, steps confidently toward the first-class counter, ticket in hand and dreams in his eyes. But instead of being greeted with respect, he's met with suspicion and prejudice. A tense confrontation unfolds, police are called, and whispers ripple through the crowd. What no one knows, what they're about to find out, is that this boy isn't just any passenger, he's the son of the airline CEO. And what happens next will change everything. The airport bustled with energy, an amalgamation of hurried footsteps, muffled announcements, and the faint roar of jet engines. Kyler Baines adjusted the strap of his sleek leather backpack and approached the ticket counter, his posture confident but unassuming. At just 16, he carried himself with the grace of someone far older, a product of his upbringing in a household where dignity and respect were non-negotiable. Today, his sharp blazer and neatly combed hair made him look every bit the polished young man his parents had raised, but to the world at large, he was just another black teenager. Kyler reached the counter and handed over his ticket with a polite smile. The airline staff member on duty, a middle-aged man with a sharp, hawk-like nose and a name tag that read Mr. Trent, barely glanced at him before taking the ticket. The man's dismissive demeanor was immediately evident. First class, Trent muttered, furrowing his brow as he scrutinized the ticket. His lips curled into a smirk as his eyes flicked back to Kyler. This doesn't seem right. Kyler, already accustomed to the subtle insinuations people often made, kept his voice steady. Yes, sir, that's my ticket. Trent let out a low chuckle, the kind that dripped with condescension. Sure it is. Let me guess, you found it somewhere. The air between them grew tense, but Kyler held his ground. It's my ticket. I purchased it. If you need to verify. Don't bother, Trent interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. We both know what this is about. Kyler blinked, caught off guard by the blatant accusation. He glanced at the growing line of passengers behind him, some of whom were already beginning to whisper, their eyes darting between him and the counter. He could feel the weight of their gazes, but he refused to let it show. I'd like to speak to your manager, Kyler said calmly, his voice steady but firm. Trent crossed his arms, leaning against the counter with exaggerated ease. Manager? Kid, I am the manager. His grin widened, smug and self-satisfied. Now, why don't you stop wasting everyone's time and move along? Kyler's mind raced, but his expression remained composed. He wasn't just frustrated, he was hurt. No matter how many times his parents told him to rise above ignorance, moments like these stung. The idea that someone could look at him and instantly assume the worst chipped away at the confidence he worked so hard to maintain. You still haven't answered my question, Kyler said, his voice calm but laced with quiet defiance. Are you going to verify my ticket or not? Trent's smirk faltered for a split second, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. It was clear he wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Kyler. I don't need to verify anything, Trent snapped, straightening up. I've been in this job long enough to know a fake when I see one. Now leave before I call security. Kyler felt a pang of disbelief. This couldn't be happening, not again. He had faced microaggressions before, sure, but this was something else entirely. Call them, Kyler said, surprising even himself with the steadiness in his voice. Because I'm not leaving. Passengers around them began murmuring louder now, their curiosity turning into unease. A young woman a few spots back in line pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the camera app. Kyler caught her eye briefly, but he quickly looked away. He didn't want this to become a spectacle. He just wanted what he was entitled to, respect. Trent, however, was determined to escalate, pulling out his walkie-talkie. He barked into it. We've got a situation at Gate 12. Need security here immediately. Kyler's stomach tightened, but he refused to let his nerves show. He had learned from his father that composure was the greatest weapon against prejudice. They'll sort this out, he told himself. The truth will come out. But even as he thought it, doubt crept in. Would the truth even matter to people like Trent, to the officers on their way? The police arrived swiftly, 2 officers walking briskly through the terminal. Their presence caused a ripple effect among the passengers, who parted to let them through, their murmurs growing louder. Kyler turned to face them, clutching his backpack a little tighter. That's him, Trent said, pointing a finger at Kyler with exaggerated flair, as if identifying a criminal mastermind. He's trying to board first class with a fraudulent ticket. The officers exchanged a glance before focusing their attention on Kyler. Son, One of them said, his tone neither kind nor hostile. "We need to see your identification." Kyler handed over his ID without hesitation. "It's my ticket," he said again, his voice calm but firm. "You can verify it with the system." Trent interjected before the officers could respond. "Don't waste your time. I've already seen it. It's fake." One of the officers raised an eyebrow at Trent. "You're sure about that?" Trent puffed out his chest. "Positive." Kyler felt his pulse quicken as one of the officers stepped closer. "Do you have someone we can call, a parent or guardian?" It was a simple question, but the underlying implication stung. Someone who can vouch for you because you're not credible enough on your own. Kyler's expression hardened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'll make the call myself," he said quietly. He scrolled through his contacts, his fingers hovering over a familiar number. His father had always told him to call if he ever found himself in trouble, but Kyler had never wanted to burden him. Now he had no choice. He pressed the number and brought the phone to his ear. When the line connected, his voice was steady but tinged with frustration. "Dad, it's happening again," he said softly. "They're accusing me of using a fake ticket." On the other end, there was a pause, brief but filled with weight. Then came the reply, deep and authoritative, "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." Kyler hung up and looked back at the officers. "My dad's on his way." Trent let out another laugh, this one louder and more dismissive than before. "What's he going to do, bail you out of this one?" Kyler didn't respond. He didn't have to, because in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. When his father arrived, everything was about to change. The terminal was silent, in a way that wasn't really silent at all. Murmurs floated through the air, like the hum of distant bees, passengers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the young black teenager surrounded by airport police. Every so often, someone would snap a photo or begin recording, curiosity outweighing decorum. Kyler Baines stood at the center of it all, clutching his phone tightly in one hand, his ticket in the other. His calm demeanor bellied the storm brewing within him. He could feel the judgment in the stares, the assumptions that whispered louder than any words. He doesn't belong. He must have done something wrong. Mr. Trent, still basking in his self-proclaimed righteousness, leaned casually against the counter. "You've got about 5 minutes, kid," he sneered. "Then it's off to holding until we can confirm this little charade of yours." Kyler didn't respond. He wasn't going to give Trent the satisfaction. Instead, he turned his attention to the sliding glass doors at the far end of the terminal. Any moment now. Outside, a sleek black SUV roared to a stop at the curb, tires screeching slightly on the smooth pavement. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Victor Baines, CEO of Baines Air, and a figure of commanding presence, dressed in a tailored suit that complemented his tall, broad frame. Victor radiated power and authority, but beneath his polished exterior, his eyes burned with a barely restrained fury. Victor had spent his career fighting battles others couldn't see. As one of the few black CEOs in a notoriously homogeneous industry, he knew the weight of discrimination all too well. But nothing stung more than seeing his son face it again. "Stay with the car," Victor barked at his driver, his voice clipped and cold. Then, without another word, he strode through the automatic doors, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor like gunfire. The sight of him was magnetic. Heads turned as he walked, whispers quickly shifting from Kyler to the imposing man now heading straight for Gate 12. The passengers sensed it before they knew it. Something big was about to happen. "Dad," Kyler's voice broke the tension, his relief palpable as Victor approached. He didn't rush to his father like a frightened child. Kyler wasn't the type, but the subtle shift in his posture, the way he straightened his shoulders just a little more, spoke volumes. Victor's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the two officers flanking his son, the growing crowd, and finally, the smirking face of Mr. Trent. For a moment, he said nothing, his silence heavier than any words. "Who's in charge here?" Victor's voice cut through the air like a blade, calm but laced with an authority that demanded immediate attention. Trent, oblivious to the storm he'd just invited, stepped forward with a cocky grin. "That would be me," he said. "Mr. Trent, assistant manager for customer service. Can I help you?" Victor's gaze landed on Trent, and the smirk faltered. There was something unnerving about the way Victor looked at him, like a lion sizing up prey. "You called the police on my son," Victor said, his voice still eerily calm. "Explain." Trent blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. Your son. His eyes darted to Kyler, then back to Victor. Well, sir, I had no idea he was. Answer the question, Victor interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make Trent flinch. Why did you call the police on a paying customer? Trent's face flushed. It wasn't personal. I had reason to believe the ticket was fraudulent. These kinds of things happen all the time. I was just doing my job. Victor took a step closer, his presence towering over Trent. Your job, he said slowly, is to serve all passengers with dignity and respect. Do you think you've done that today? Trent opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The confidence he'd worn like armor just moments ago was cracking, revealing the insecurity beneath. I thought. You thought wrong, Victor snapped. For the first time, his anger broke through, his voice echoing across the terminal. You didn't think at all. You judged my son based on nothing but your own biases, and now you're standing here trying to justify it. The officers stood stiffly, their uniforms a visual representation of authority, but their faces betrayed uncertainty. Victor Baines loomed before them, a man who exuded power not from a badge, but from his unwavering presence. His sharp, commanding voice had cut through the terminal's buzz, silencing passengers and staff alike. The senior officer, a burly man in his 40s, stepped forward, glancing between Victor and Mr. Trent, the assistant manager. Sir, we were responding to a report of a disturbance, he said cautiously, his tone bordering indefensible. We didn't know. Victor raised a hand, silencing him. Let me be very clear, he said, his voice low but firm. The only disturbance here is the blatant discrimination my son has just endured. The younger officer, clearly less experienced, shifted uncomfortably, his hand hovering near his radio. Mr. Baines, he began tentatively, we weren't aware of who your son was. We were just following protocol. Protocol? Victor interrupted, his eyes narrowing. Is it protocol to harass a paying customer without verifying the facts, to escalate a situation based solely on the assumptions of an incompetent employee? The senior officer cleared his throat, his gaze flickering to Trent for support, but the assistant manager, who had been so smug just moments ago, now stood frozen, his face pale and his confidence shattered. The crowd, emboldened by Victor's calm but commanding presence, began to murmur louder. Passengers whispered to each other, their indignation palpable. He's right, a middle-aged woman said loudly enough for others to hear. I was right here when it happened. That boy didn't do anything wrong. Yeah, it's disgusting, another voice chimed in, the way they treated him. Several passengers began pulling out their phones, recording the confrontation. The senior officer's jaw tightened as he realized the situation was spiraling out of control. The court of public opinion was already forming its verdict, and it wasn't in their favor. Victor turned to face the growing audience, his voice carrying the weight of his frustration and determination. What happened here today isn't just about my son, he said, his tone steady but passionate. It's about a system that allows people like Mr. Trent to abuse their authority and make baseless assumptions about who belongs where. The murmur swelled into a collective rumble of agreement. A few passengers clapped softly, the sound building as others joined in. Trent's eyes darted nervously around the terminal, his earlier bravado completely dissolved. Victor turned back to Trent, who now looked as though he wanted to sink into the floor. Mr. Trent, Victor began, his voice dripping with controlled fury. I want to hear it from you. What gave you the right to call the police on my son without verifying his ticket? Trent stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. I thought. He trailed off, swallowing hard under Victor's unrelenting gaze. You thought, Victor said coldly. What, exactly, did you think, Mr. Trent? That a young black teenager couldn't possibly afford a first-class ticket? That he didn't belong in this terminal because of the color of his skin? Trent's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. The crowd's whispers grew louder, their disdain for him evident. Victor took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone. You've not only embarrassed yourself today, Mr. Trent, you've embarrassed this airline. An airline that I built from the ground up. And I will not allow someone like you to tarnish its reputation. Trent's eyes widened in horror. Wait, what? He stammered. You're the CEO? Victor didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth hung heavy in the air, the weight of it enough to crush what little was left of Trent's ego. You're fired, Victor said simply, the words cutting through the tent like a blade. Trent's face drained of color. "Please, Mr. Baines," he begged, his voice trembling. "It was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to." "Save it," Victor snapped, his patience finally wearing thin. "You made your decision the moment you judged my son without cause. Now you'll face the consequences." The senior officer cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Mr. Baines, if there's anything we can do to rectify this." Victor turned to him, his expression unyielding. "You can start by holding people like Trent accountable, instead of enabling them. And while you're at it, I suggest you and your department undergo serious training on how to handle situations like this without escalating them unnecessarily." The officer nodded quickly, his earlier confidence completely eroded. "Of course, sir. We'll take immediate steps." Satisfied, Victor returned to Kyler, who had been watching the entire exchange in silence. "Let's go," he said gently, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We're done here." As they walked toward the gate, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, passengers whispering words of admiration and support. Some even clapped again, the sound following Victor and Kyler as they boarded the plane. The first-class cabin was serene, a stark contrast to the chaos left behind in the terminal. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Victor Baines leaned back in his seat, his eyes scanning the in-flight menu with little interest. His thoughts were elsewhere, his mind replaying the events at the gate. Though he delivered swift justice to Mr. Trent, the incident felt like a symptom of a larger, festering issue, one that couldn't be solved with a single firing. Seated beside him, Kyler was unusually quiet. The teenager gazed out the window, watching the clouds drift past in a sea of blue and white. Victor studied his son for a moment, noting the tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his posture. Finally, he broke the silence. "Kyler," he said softly, "what are you thinking?" Kyler didn't turn away from the window. "I'm thinking about how many times this has happened," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Not just to me, but to other people, people who don't have someone like you to back them up." Victor felt a pang of guilt. He knew Kyler was right. The privilege of power had shielded them both in ways it couldn't for so many others. "You're right," he admitted, "and that's exactly why we need to do more." Victor reached into the leather briefcase tucked beneath his seat and pulled out a sleek tablet. He tapped the screen a few times before turning it toward Kyler. The screen displayed a draft of an email, its subject line bold and unapologetic. "Internal policy overhaul, diversity, equity, and accountability." Kyler blinked, momentarily startled. "You're already writing an email about this?" Victor smiled faintly. "I started drafting this months ago," he confessed. "Incidents like today are part of a much bigger problem in this industry. We've made progress, but it's not enough. If this is going to change, we need to lead the charge." Kyler skimmed the email, noting phrases like mandatory bias training and zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. His eyes paused at the section titled Youth Advisory Panel. "What's this about?" he asked, pointing to the line. Victor leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about ways to bring younger voices into the conversation. People like you, who've experienced these issues firsthand, need a seat at the table. I want you to help me lead this." Kyler looked up sharply, his brow furrowing. "Me? But I don't know anything about running an airline." "You don't need to," Victor replied. "What you do know is what it feels like to be judged unfairly. That perspective is just as valuable, if not more so, than any business degree." Kyler hesitated, the weight of the offer sinking in. He wasn't sure if he was ready for something like this, but the idea of making a real difference tugged at him. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight crew prepared for the dinner service. Victor turned his attention fully to Kyler, sensing his hesitation. "I know this isn't what you had in mind," Victor said gently. "You're young, and you should be focused on enjoying your life. But moments like today, they remind us that the world won't wait for us to be ready. Change comes when we decide to make it happen." Kyler finally looked at his father, his eyes searching Victor's face for some sign of doubt. But there was none. Victor's expression was resolute, his confidence in Kyler unwavering. "Do you really think I can do this?" Kyler asked, his voice quieter now. Victor nodded firmly. "I know you can. And you won't be doing it alone. We'll do this together." As the plane neared its destination, Victor's phone buzzed with notifications. The video of the terminal confrontation had gone viral, sparking outrage and widespread debate. News outlets were picking up the story, headlines ranging from "Teen Targeted at Gate" Airline CEO speaks out to a wake-up call for racial bias in the airline industry. Victor handed the phone to Kyler, letting him scroll through the comments. The responses were a mix of anger, support, and calls for accountability. One comment in particular caught Kyler's attention. "I've been through this before. It's about time someone did something to stop it." He stared at the screen for a moment before handing the phone back to his father. "If we're going to do this," he said, his voice steady, "I want to make sure it actually matters. I don't want this to be another empty promise." Victor's lips curved into a small smile. "Neither do I," he said. "That's why we're starting with this airline. But it won't stop there." By the time the plane landed, Victor and Kyler had outlined the beginnings of a bold initiative, a comprehensive program that would not only address bias within the airline, but also set a precedent for the entire industry. They would roll out new training programs, establish accountability measures, and create platforms for marginalized voices to be heard. As they disembarked, the pilot himself stood at the cockpit door, saluting Victor and Kyler with a warm smile. "Mr. Baines," he said, "it's an honor to fly you and your son today, and thank you for what you're doing." Victor nodded graciously, but it was Kyler who replied, his voice carrying a newfound confidence. "It's just the beginning." That evening, back at their home, Victor and Kyler sat in the family study, their laptops open and documents spread across the desk. The light from the desk lamp illuminated their focused expressions as they worked late into the night, crafting the foundation for what would soon become a groundbreaking initiative. For Kyler, this was more than a project, it was a mission. And for Victor, it was a chance to pass down more than just a business. It was a chance to leave behind a legacy of justice, equality, and hope. The Baines home buzzed with activity the following morning. The study had transformed into a command center, with emails flooding in and phone calls coming nonstop. Victor's assistant, Miss Riley, had arrived at dawn, her tablet loaded with schedules and press inquiries. Meanwhile, Kyler sat at the corner desk, poring over drafts of the initiative's framework, his brow furrowed in concentration. The world outside had caught fire with the story. Major news outlets were dissecting the viral video, talk shows were debating systemic discrimination, and social media was flooded with hashtags like airline accountability and justice for Kyler. The Baines initiative was no longer just an internal policy. It was quickly becoming a rallying cry for change. Victor glanced at his watch. "Kyler," he called, his voice cutting through the din of the room. "Time to head to the office. We've got a meeting with the executive team." Kyler looked up, hesitating. "You really want me to be there?" he asked. Victor nodded. "This isn't just about policy, it's about perspective. They need to hear from you." An hour later, they walked into the boardroom at Baines Air's headquarters. The room was sleek and modern, with a long glass table and panoramic windows offering views of the city skyline. Seated around the table were the company's top executives, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Victor took his place at the head of the table, his presence commanding. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "As you're all aware, yesterday's incident has highlighted a systemic issue, not just within our company, but across the industry." He gestured to Kyler. "This is my son, Kyler. He's the reason we're here today, and he's going to help us lead this change." The executives exchanged surprised glances, but Victor pressed on. "We're implementing a comprehensive initiative, effective immediately. This includes mandatory bias training, stricter accountability measures, and the creation of a youth advisory panel to bring fresh perspectives to the table." One of the executives, a senior VP with decades of experience, raised her hand. "Mr. Baines," she said cautiously, "while I fully support the intent behind this, don't you think it's ambitious? Overhauling our entire culture isn't something we can do overnight." Victor's gaze was steady. "I'm not asking for overnight change. I'm asking for commitment. If we want to remain leaders in this industry, we need to lead by example." Victor turned to Kyler, giving him a nod. Kyler stood, his heart pounding, but his resolve firm. "I know I'm young," he began, "and I don't have your experience. But I know what it feels like to be judged before you even open your mouth, and I know I'm not the only one." He paused, meeting the eyes of each executive in turn. "If we're serious about making this airline a place where everyone feels welcome, then we can't just talk about change, we have to act. People are watching now, and not just because of what happened to me. They're watching because they want to believe we can do better." The room was silent for a moment, before the senior VP nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "You're right, Kyler," she said. It's time we stopped just talking. Over the next few weeks, Baines Air became the center of attention in the corporate world. The company announced its diversity and accountability initiative, complete with a detailed plan for implementation. Press conferences were held, with Victor and Kyler speaking candidly about their experiences and their vision for the future. The youth advisory panel, spearheaded by Kyler, quickly gained traction. It included young voices from diverse backgrounds, each bringing unique perspectives to the table. Together, they worked to identify gaps in the company's policies and recommend actionable solutions. Victor, true to his word, ensured the initiative wasn't just a PR stunt. He allocated significant resources to training programs, recruitment efforts, and community outreach. Employees across the company participated in workshops designed to challenge biases and foster empathy. The ripple effects of Baines Air's actions extended far beyond the company. Other airlines, feeling the pressure from public scrutiny, began implementing similar measures. Industry leaders praised Victor's boldness, while advocacy groups highlighted the initiative as a blueprint for addressing systemic inequality. Kyler found himself in a whirlwind of interviews, panel discussions, and strategy meetings. Though it was overwhelming at times, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced before. He wasn't just his father's son, he was a voice for change. As Baines Air's diversity and accountability initiative gained traction, the pushback was inevitable. Change often came with resistance, and this was no exception. While many praised the Baines efforts, others were less enthusiastic. Victor sat at the head of a conference table in Baines Air's headquarters, his laptop open to a scathing editorial in a prominent business journal. The article accused the company of pandering to public opinion and suggested that the initiative was a distraction from core business operations. It wasn't the first such piece, and Victor doubted it would be the last. Across the table, Kyler scrolled through his phone, his expression darkening as he read through social media comments. Some praised his courage, but others were outright hostile. This kid doesn't know anything about business. Nepotism at its finest. Another CEO using a sob story for PR. Dad, Kyler said, finally breaking the tense silence. How do you deal with this? People saying things about you that aren't true. Victor looked up, his expression calm but serious. You learn, he said. Learn to focus on what matters. The people who want change, the ones who are counting on us, they're the reason we do this, not the critics. Victor's words were put to the test sooner than he expected. A week later, an anonymous whistleblower leaked an internal memo to the press. The memo, written by a middle manager, criticized the initiative as unrealistic and claimed it was creating division within the company. The media seized on the leak, framing it as evidence of internal strife at Baines Air. Competitors took the opportunity to cast doubt on the company's leadership, with some even suggesting the initiative was driving customers away. In a crisis meeting with his executive team, Victor remained unflinching. This memo doesn't represent Baines Air, he said firmly. It represents fear. Fear of change, fear of accountability, and we will not let fear dictate our actions. One of the executives, the senior VP who had initially expressed doubts about the initiative, spoke up. Victor, if we're going to combat this, we need to show results. Concrete, measurable progress. Victor nodded. Agreed. Let's focus on the data. I want a full report on employee feedback, customer satisfaction, and any other metrics we can use to demonstrate the impact of this initiative. For Kyler, the memo was a personal blow. He had been working closely with employees as part of the youth advisory panel, and the idea that someone within the company was undermining their efforts felt like a betrayal. One evening, as he sat in the study, Kyler received an email from an employee who had been part of a recent workshop. The email was heartfelt, detailing how the training had opened her eyes to her own biases and helped her connect with coworkers in ways she never thought possible. Kyler forwarded the email to his father with a note. We need more stories like this. People need to see the human side of what we're doing. Victor replied almost immediately, You're right. Let's highlight these stories in our communications. The leaked memo proved to be a blessing in disguise. As Victor and Kyler doubled down on transparency, they began to share more stories from employees and customers who had been positively impacted by the initiative. Testimonials poured in. Flight attendants who felt empowered to speak up about workplace issues, passengers who noticed a more inclusive atmosphere, and young professionals inspired by Kyler's leadership. The data backed up the anecdotes. Customer satisfaction scores were up, and employee engagement had increased significantly. Even critics couldn't ignore the numbers. At a press conference to address the controversy, Victor stood beside Kyler as they presented the findings. "Change is never easy," Victor said, his voice steady but passionate. "But at Bain's Air, we believe it's necessary. And the results speak for themselves." When it was Kyler's turn to speak, he stepped forward, his hands clasped tightly, but his voice unwavering. "This isn't just about one company," he said. "It's about setting a standard for an entire industry. We're not perfect, and we're still learning, but we're committed to doing better, and we're not going to stop." The press conference was a resounding success. The narrative shifted, with media outlets highlighting the company's progress and its willingness to confront challenges head-on. That evening, back at home, Kyler and Victor sat together in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting warm light across the room. Kyler was quieter than usual, lost in thought. "What's on your mind?" Victor asked, his tone gentle. Kyler looked up, his expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "I didn't think it would be this hard," he admitted, "but I'm starting to see why it's worth it." Victor smiled, his pride evident. "It is worth it," he said, "and you've shown people that it's possible to fight for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." Kyler nodded slowly, his resolve solidifying. For the first time, he felt not just like his father's son, but like someone carving his own path, someone making a difference. Months passed, and the Bain's work began to bear fruit. The Diversity and Accountability Initiative was no longer just a policy. It had become a cultural shift within Bain's Air. Employees from all levels of the organization felt the changes. More inclusivity, more openness, and a renewed sense of purpose. The company's transformation had not only restored its reputation, but had also set a benchmark for the entire airline industry. Kyler had grown into his role on the youth advisory panel, balancing school and his new responsibilities with a maturity beyond his years. His voice, once hesitant, now carried weight. He had become a symbol of resilience and progress, earning respect from both his peers and industry leaders. But with success came new challenges. Victor called an emergency meeting at the headquarters one morning. The airline industry was facing a new controversy. Several major competitors had been accused of turning a blind eye to discriminatory practices, from hiring biases to unfair treatment of passengers. As the team gathered in the boardroom, Victor stood at the head of the table, his expression grim. "We've come a long way," he began, "but the work isn't over. The spotlight is on this industry right now, and it's our responsibility to lead by example." He turned to Kyler. "I want you to represent Bain's Air at the Global Aviation Conference next month. It's time the world hears your perspective." Kyler froze, stunned. "Me? In front of all those CEOs and executives?" Victor nodded. "Yes, you've earned this. Your voice matters, and it's time they hear it." The weeks leading up to the conference were a whirlwind. Kyler worked tirelessly with Victor and the youth advisory panel to craft a speech that would resonate on a global stage. Late nights in the study became the norm, with Victor coaching Kyler on public speaking and strategy. "I'm proud of you," Victor said one night as they wrapped up another practice session. "But remember, this isn't just about what you say, it's about what you inspire others to do." Kyler nodded, feeling the weight of his father's words. This wasn't just another event. It was a chance to influence the future of an entire industry. The day of the conference arrived. Held in a sprawling convention center, the event was attended by leaders from every corner of the airline industry. The stage was set, with a sleek podium flanked by massive screens displaying the conference logo. Kyler sat backstage, his heart pounding as he waited for his turn. Victor placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've got this," he said. "Just speak from the heart." When Kyler's name was called, the audience erupted into applause. He walked onto the stage, his nerves melting away as he took in the crowd. Standing behind the podium, he began, "My name is Kyler Baines, and I'm here because change doesn't happen by accident, it happens by choice." He shared his experience at the terminal, using it as a lens to discuss systemic issues in the industry. He spoke of the need for accountability, the power of inclusivity, and the importance of giving young voices a platform. "Our differences aren't a weakness," he concluded, "they're our strength. And if we want this industry to thrive, we have to embrace that." The room erupted into a standing ovation. Industry leaders approached him after his speech, commending his courage and insight. For Kyler, it was a moment of validation, not just for himself, but for everything he and his father had worked toward. Years later, Baines Air was known not just for its excellent service, but also for its commitment to equity and justice. Kyler, now a young adult, had taken on a leadership role within the company, continuing his father's legacy while carving his own path. Victor, though stepping back from day-to-day operations, remained a guiding force. He often reflected on the moment in the terminal that had sparked this journey, grateful for the lessons it had taught both him and Kyler. The Baines story became a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the lasting impact of a legacy built on integrity. And though their work was far from over, they faced the future with unwavering determination, knowing that together they could change the world, one step at a time.